All right, let's get into some Canberra issues. Victoria's COVID-19 curve begins to flatten now, of course. The biggest threat to Australia, though, lies not in the global pandemic, but rather state protectionism. The jarring comments from Anastasia Palaszczuk last week sum it up.
People living in New South Wales, they have New South Wales hospitals. In Queensland, we have Queensland hospitals for our people.
The Australian's editor-at-large, Paul Kelly, doesn't think there's a place for this, and he joins me now from Sydney. Paul, thank you for your time. You've noticed this comment from Palaszczuk, and you've written this is straight from the Bjelke-Petersen playbook a generation ago. It's not a good look.
Well, those comments, Peter, summarise one of the problems with Australian politics at the moment, and this is the border closures when they're not justified, and they are not justified between two states that have got a very low number of cases. Clearly the border closures between New South Wales and Victoria are justified. What we're seeing at the moment is what I call pandemic protectionism, and it's the state premiers campaigning to look after Queenslanders or look after Western Australians, keeping their borders shut. That undermines the national economy, it undermines economic recovery. It is not a balanced approach to tackling the two problems, the medical problem and the economic problem. And at the end of the day, we're one country. We have to operate as one country, and there's no future for us turning inwards and creating a new system of Fortress Australia based along state borders.
You've also said that the weakness of Morrison's position is embarrassing. Now, I agree with that, but isn't that just the constitutional reality?
Well, the weakness of the Prime Minister's position stems from the fact that at the present time, the premiers have got control of the health response. They've got control of the medical response on the one hand, and they're running a policy the Prime Minister doesn't agree with. Most of the states are running an elimination strategy, and they're running closed borders. Now, the Prime Minister, as he repeats virtually every day, doesn't agree with either of those propositions. But his difficulty is that he can't do anything about it. Now, normally, the national government would use economic power and the money power to bring the states into line, but he can't do that, because if he was to really significantly cut back JobKeeper and JobSeeker, then the person who would pay the price for that would be the Prime Minister, not the premiers.
Yeah, but just on that point, I mean, financially, all the risks with the Commonwealth, the only measure the premiers have, insofar as there is a measure in this, at least in the short term, is the daily sort of case numbers, the COVID updates, and that's giving them cover. That's all they have to do to keep down. The Prime Minister keeps signing these checks. As you say, he's quite constrained politically on that. But the long-term economic damage, look at the state of Victoria, I mean, it's horrific at the moment. That will eventually bear on the state budgets. But, you know, there's not a lot of scrutiny on state government. And I think, you know, most Australians through this crisis, Paul, have actually now got a better understanding than they probably ever have before of actually how much power, how much responsibility resides with our state premiers.
Well, that's very true, and it's particularly true in a pandemic. And what is absolutely clear in a pandemic, and we now see it on display on a daily basis, is that the premiers are calling the shots. And they can live with the fact that there is damage being done to their economies. But the reason they can do that is because the Morrison government, through its own funding, through its own massive economic stimulus, is essentially keeping the economies alive in these various states, which enable them to get away with their border protection policy. So it's a vicious circle, but it's a circle where the influence of the Prime Minister is not nearly as strong as it would be in normal times.
Yeah, and I think if Australians had a chance to change that power and disparity, I think they would at the moment. I've got to ask you about this speech today. Well, actually, it wasn't the speech so much that was extraordinary. It was the question and answer session that we don't often see, certainly in Australia, with Chinese officials. The deputy head of the Chinese Embassy in Australia, Minister Wang Xinying, addressed the press club. He spoke, as I said, a range of topics right across trade, security, a whole lot. Let's have a listen.
Frankly, there are some shadows, I think, over here about our relationship. So we need to make our position much more clear in order to remove these shadows and let the sun shining on our relationship. And, it's under COVID-19, it's not possible to organize face-to-face exchange between leaders of countries and even senior ministers. But the diplomatic channels are always open. We have issues. I keep in contact with my counterpart. So are my colleague with other portfolio. The diplomatic are always channel. It is easy for us to talk about the issues. There's no block in between.
That was his argument for people at home who didn't see the whole speech about why the ministers weren't talking, that the embassies at least were. What did you make of this speech, in particular his refusal to deny a story that was in The Australian on Monday by Sharri Markson, the 1,000 Talents program, refused to deny it was espionage? What did you make of the speech?
Well, clearly the Deputy Ambassador was reflecting the position of the Beijing government, and we would never expect anything else. So in this sense, it was an assertive speech, a defensive speech when it came to the criticisms of China. I think he was most exposed on this question of ministerial contacts during the question time. Now, the fact of the matter is that China has deliberately put Australia in the deep freeze. It won't contact senior Australian ministers. There is no meaningful dialogue between ministers. Now, this is simply appalling. There's no excuse for this. And it's China which has decided to take this decision. He was really ineffective. He was really ineffective at attempting to justify and explain this. And I think this is one of the problems China's got at the moment, because I think the overwhelming impression of the Australian people is that China is responsible for the freeze in relations, that China is responsible for the bad relations. And I think this is an enormous difficulty that China's got in terms of the bilateral relationship.
I think you're absolutely right. I think business, though, were pretty tough on the government unfairly, but the balance sheet's what's driving some of their comments. Paul Kelly, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.